another senior thesis group mentored by Dr. McQuiston.
Hello, we're Dr. McQuiston's group, and we're presenting on Paws and Effects, Sniffing Out Juror Bias. I'm Jade. I'm Parker.
I'm Garrett. I'm Ryan.
I'm Sydney.
And I'm Talley.
So, jurors are assembled to listen to the facts, evidence, and testimony of the case, and draw their own conclusions on that case. This right to a fair trial by an impartial jury is protected under the 6th Amendment. However, this fairness can sometimes be compromised by things that we call extra-legal factors, or factors that can influence a juror's opinions in the courtroom. Understanding how juries function and how extra-legal factors can sway verdicts highlights the gap between how the legal system should function and how it actually does.
So one of the most important extra legal factors to look at is gender, especially the defendant gender. And so we saw, looking at previous research, that compared to female defendants, male defendants were found guilty more often, sent to prison more often, and held more responsible for their actions. One of the leading theories behind this is the chivalry thesis. This pretty much states that men view women as childlike and need protection, and this leads to more leniency for women. Additionally, the portrayal by the media also plays a role in this, with women being more likely to be seen as a victim of a crime in the media and men more likely to be the perpetrator. So while it is important to protect the rights of the defendant, like I just talked about, it is also important to recognize the rights of the victim. So a vulnerable witness is anyone who might have mental or physical issues that might prevent them from testifying in the courtroom. However, there are accommodations that can help them through this process. One growing accommodation is the use of a facility dog. These are specially trained dogs that provide emotional support on the witness stand in the courtroom. And so while there's plenty of research that indicates plenty of positive benefits for these dogs, there are major concerns about them as well. One of the big ones being that they will violate the defendant's right to due process by causing extra sympathy towards the defendant, or towards the victim. So while research indicates that this might actually be the case, there is no impact then on verdict or sentencing, and just more extra sympathy. One thing that has not been researched, however, is when the facility dog is actually with the defendant on the stand and not with the witness. And so looking at that, and also how mental health stereotypes associated with gender play a role.
So, therefore, the purpose of the current study is to examine how a facility dog's presence and the gender of the defendant might affect jurors' decision-making. So, the design of this study, it was a 2x2 between groups factorial design. The first independent variable was whether the dog was present, whether the facility dog was present at the side of the defendant, or whether they were absent. And the other independent variable was the gender of the defendant.
So in our study, we had 3 hypotheses. The first one was a facility's dog present would not affect how jurors assess a defendant's guiltiness, but may affect how they feel about this defendant. The second one was male defendants would be viewed more negatively than female defendants. And the third one was male defendants accompanied by a facility dog would be viewed more negatively than female defendants accompanied by a facility dog. So this year in our current study, we had 140 participants, and it was a general population sample, with the mean age being 54 and the majority of participants being female and white. Ultimately, we wanted to combine last year's senior thesis group with this year's senior thesis group to increase the power in our study, bringing our total participants to 300, with the mean age being 42. And the demographics from last year's senior thesis group and this year's senior thesis group were very similar, with females and white being the majority of our participants. And all of the data that we're showing today is the 300 participants together. So the materials in the case included 2, with a fictitious criminal case and then a 22-item questionnaire. The case details are a single mom or dad living alone in an unsafe neighborhood, and as a result of this, the parent had an unsecured handgun. One night, the two children were playing unsupervised in the parent's room when the 4-year-old child grabbed the gun and shot their 5-year-old sibling. In South Carolina, with a case like this, there would be 2 charges. The first charge would be unlawful conduct for a child, and then the second one would be involuntary manslaughter. The case varied in 2 different ways, with the defendant, the gender of the defendant being male or female, mom or dad, and or if the defendant had a courthouse facility dog present with them on the stand. And then what participants did in our study was they read the fictitious criminal case and then answered a series of questions pertaining to verdicts, sentencing, and overall impressions of the case and the defendant.
So when it came to our results, for our first charge, the more serious of the 2 charges, when participants were asked to give a verdict and a punishment for each charge, 72% of our defendants were given guilty verdicts and 27% of them were given prison for their punishment. And overall, for the first charge, we found that female defendants were given more guilty verdicts and more prison time overall. Now, for our second charge, 48% of our defendants were given guilty verdicts and 27% were given prison time. And once again, we see that the female defendants were given more guilty verdicts. So when participants were asked to scale how responsible they felt the defendant to be for the crime, we find that female defendants were scaled as more responsible than male defendants for the same exact crime. So after finding this with our whole sample pool, we kept in mind that there is literature that does state that jurors assess things differently based on their gender. So we wanted to see if our results would have coincided with this literature, and we did find some interesting results. We found that our main finding of female defendants being more guilty and given more prison time, this is mainly driven by our female jurors and their decisions. And another really interesting thing when we looked at male jurors only, for the first time we see the presence of a dog having an effect in the courtroom in any sense. We found, once again with male jurors, the dog being present resulted in fewer guilty verdicts and less prison time. Again, for our finding of the female defendants being scaled as more responsible, this is mainly driven by our female jurors. And when we looked at our male defendants, we see that in credibility and negligence, male jurors ranked defendants with the dog as more credible and less negligent when a dog was present. And finally, we found an interaction when looking at just female jurors, and we found that female jurors rated male defendants as less credible when they were accompanied by a facility dog.
So what do these results mean regarding our hypotheses? So our first hypothesis was partially supported. Among the male mock jurors only, they found that the defendant was more credible and less negligent with the presence of a facility dog. When we're accounting for all of our participants and all of our verdict data, we found that there was no effect of the presence of the facility dog on verdict.
So we originally predicted that male defendants would be judged more harshly than female defendants, but when we found the opposite, we realized that there's been some research that shows that there's been a shift from the chivalry paternalism thesis to the familial paternalism thesis, meaning that men are judged differently than fathers and women are judged differently than mothers. So when something happens to the child, the bar for accountability for the mother is just a little bit higher, which leads to more punitive treatment. And for the interaction, we found partial support really in the context of like mental health and defendant gender. There's been some research that shows that a male defendant with a mental health label actually increases their likelihood for incarceration, but decreases their perceived credibility. So in the current study, when we had a male defendant who was in need of a mental health accommodation, it invoked, like a facility dog, it invoked some disbelief from the mock jurors.
So overall, we found that defendants who were mothers were held more accountable than defendants who were fathers, and male mock jurors were more sympathetic to the presence of a facility dog.
So every study has their limitations, and for us, we were thinking that it could have been a problem with the way we ordered our dependent measures, specifically that the mock jurors were tasked with making a verdict decision prior to assessing their impressions about the defendant's negligence, credibility, or responsibility. And this could just be a problem if a mock juror or a juror their verdict decision presupposes their judgment.
Another limitation may have been the use of legal jargon in our case. For many participants, the legal jargon may have been difficult to comprehend. For instance, our more serious charge, unlawful conduct towards a child, may have sounded milder than manslaughter, which is actually not the case. A potential remedy for this may be providing the participants with a less legal-like description of the charge so they can better understand what they're subjecting the defendant to. Much literature shows that legal jargon is very difficult for lay people to understand, so this definitely could have been a limitation. And finally, some implications. Who should care about these results? First and foremost, jurors, you and I. We could be selected to be on a jury, and we need to understand our own biases. Secondly, attorneys. Attorneys need to understand the implications of having a facility dog present in the court when selecting their jury. And lastly, and most importantly, judges. They ultimately allow the presence of a facility dog in the courtroom, so they need to understand the impact of a facility dog and ensure the integrity of the legal system while also accounting for the safety and protection of all of those implicated in a legal case. So we'd like to thank all of our participants who took the time to be a part of the study, more specifically Ms. Lucy Woodhouse and all of our friends from the Wofford College Lifelong Learning Community. And lastly, Dr. McQuiston. We could not have done this without you, so thank you.
If the charge would have been something more aggressive, say like assault or like sexual assault, do you think your results would have changed significantly or no?
I would say, again, it just really does depend on the charge itself. There is literature out there that does assess things and juror bias based off of different charges. So, like petty crimes, there was a study that we looked into, and the male defendants are typically more viewed as more guilty and given guiltier verdicts and whatnot. And that's why in our introduction we were talking about how it typically is the male defendants that are seen as more guilty and again given more prison time overall. But with our case, it kind of goes with chivalry hypothesis and the role of the mother being responsible for the child, and I guess just societal roles like that could have switched.
I also think, like, with this case, like, it models just like a common tragedy, and a lot of the other research on facility dogs was looking at vulnerable witnesses, but this case kind of models it in a way to where you have a vulnerable defendant, so that's kind of why we went with the charges and the crime.